I am the candidate of the people of America.
On January 25, 1972, Shirley Chisholm announced her presidential campaign in Brooklyn, New York. She broke the barrier for African American women who had been deemed incapable of political involvement by running for president as the first major party African American and the first Democratic woman to do so. Her campaign revolved around advocacy for African Americans and inner city residents living in poverty. Although she did not receive the Democratic bid, Chisholm's campaign opened the door for future female African American political leaders. In the history of America to 1968, only 31 African American men and 75 women of any race had been elected to serve in Congress. Shirley Chisholm's involvement in New York politics came in the 1960s, during a time of political and social turmoil. African Americans suffered unequal access to education and discrimination in politics because of racist social norms. Efforts such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed poll taxes and literacy tests that had blocked African Americans from voting, attempted to end the barrier of discrimination in America. Although this act was passed, segregation in the United States persisted. During this time, women also faced discrimination that prevented them from participating in politics. For example, in 1960, the Equal Rights Amendment, which proposed equal legal rights for all sexes, was rejected by the Democratic Party. Women were frustrated by this decision because most didn't have access to high-paying jobs or equal education, and they were expected to lead lives at the discretion of men, all of which dissuaded women from careers in politics. Groups such as the National Organization for Women, which Shirley Chisholm co-founded in 1966, formed to advocate for the rights of women. Organizations like these spotlighted the barriers put in place by a male-dominated society and pushed for more opportunities for African American women. Shirley Chisholm grew up during the Great Depression in the low-income neighborhood of Bedford-Stuyvesant in New York City. Employment opportunities for African American women were slim during the 1950s, but she was able to find a job as an educator. The perspective she gained from this job inspired Chisholm to join local political groups, pushing for equal education. After 10 years of community organizing and gaining trust from her constituents, Chisholm decided to run for state legislature. She was the first African American woman to win this election and immediately used her new political power to advocate for more representation for African Americans and for gender equality in politics.
Until a woman is president, we can't say women can be and do anything. And I think that was largely her motivation. So she talked later in her presidential campaign about the discrimination she had faced as a woman and why she thought it was important to try to get past that.
Because she experienced the oppression of inner-city minorities firsthand, Chisholm knew what kind of leadership was necessary to make change and decided she could best fight for her district's needs at a national level. In 1968, Chisholm expanded her advocacy for impoverished urban communities by running for the United States House of Representatives. She won this election, becoming the first African American woman in the House. Many of her ideas were pushed aside by her fellow congressmen, who assigned her to the Committee of Agriculture, an area in which she had no experience. Chisholm's reception by the other members of Congress in Washington made her realize that she had to advance social change, not just for New York, but nationwide.
I stand before you today as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States of America.
Shirley Chisholm announced her presidential campaign in front of supporters in Bedford-Stuyvesant in January of 1972. By running for president, she challenged the precedent that African American women were unfit to hold office.
She's the first African American woman to run for presidency at a time in which the American public wasn't even accustomed or open to the idea of a woman running for presidency. So to have a woman and an African American woman running for presidency, I think many In the public, the media, her colleagues underestimated her and just didn't think it was possible.
Her campaign advocated for abortion rights, funding for urban communities, and access to education for all. Chisholm's platform was unique because she actively engaged with voters and refused to be influenced by big donors, inspiring her slogan, Unbought and Unbossed. In the beginning of her presidential run, most of the press, especially broadcasting agencies, didn't take her seriously and rarely wrote or televised about her campaign. Chisholm and her main competitor, George McGovern, a Democratic senator from South Dakota, shared many of the same values, but the public favored McGovern because, as a white man, they believed he was more likely to win against incumbent President Richard Nixon. In her own district, Chisholm's grassroots campaign strategy earned her the support of many women. But in spite of the fear of being labeled as racist or sexist, most political leaders were unwilling to support her. As Chisholm's nationwide campaign grew, she showed the American public that an African American woman could make an impact in politics.
What's wrong with my running for president of this country? After all, for 15 years, I have been the ghostwriter for a lot of them.
Despite Chisholm's effort and outreach, her presidential run came to an end at the 1972 Democratic National Convention. Shirley Chisholm struggled to gain the support of the delegates from the Congressional Black Caucus, a group she had co-founded. They were unwilling to back her because the caucus believed that an African American man would be more successful than a woman in a presidential campaign. Without their support, she was left in fourth place by the end of the convention. Chisholm ended her presidential campaign, but had shown America that it was possible for women and African Americans to have a voice in politics. After dropping out of the race for Democratic nominee, Shirley Chisholm brought the values from her campaign into her work in Congress. In 1977, she co-founded the Congressional Women's Caucus, which provided a space of understanding for women. Throughout her entire time in Congress, she sponsored over 60 bills individually, most advocating for civil rights and equal education opportunities. By the time Chisholm retired from Congress in 1983, she had shown that African American women could be leaders in politics, regardless of their race or gender. Since Shirley Chisholm's presidential campaign, 46 Black women have served in Congress. Chisholm's campaign taught minorities to not wait their turn anymore and have confidence in their own ideas. It also showed all African American women that the desire to achieve isn't just for white men. Directly following her run, 3 more Black women were elected to Congress in 1973, and other professions began benefiting from the insight of African American women. Representative Barbara Lee began her career in politics as a campaigner for Chisholm's presidential run, and is still an advocate for the values that Shirley Chisholm fought for in her campaign. In the 2018 election, many African American female candidates cited Shirley Chisholm as a political leader who inspired them to run for office.
Shirley Chisholm was a woman who inspired other women. She was a woman who had courage.
The fight for civil rights and education that was the cornerstone of Shirley Chisholm's campaign continues to be a pressing issue in today's society. Her outspoken advocacy was disregarded during her time, but still reflects the injustices of modern America.
I think Shirley Chisholm will go down in history as the one who really broke that barrier that said to women, wait your turn.
Shirley Chisholm emerged during a time of unequal access to politics and education for African Americans and women. She quickly rose from local politics to the U.S. Congress on the platform of advocating for the rights of inner-city residents. Her strong belief in social justice for all inspired her to run for president in 1972. Through grassroots campaigning, she gained the support of many women, but was unable to sway the opinions of enough male voters. Despite this loss, her presidential campaign, the bills she passed, and the speeches she made showed that it was possible for minorities to have a voice in politics. Shirley Chisholm broke the barrier of the systematic exclusion of African American women from politics, showing that the oppressed can make a change in America.